Dr. Sarah Chun hadn't slept in 47 hours. The cold fluorescent lights of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center hummed above her as she stared at the data streaming across 3 monitors, her coffee long since gone cold in its chipped mug. Outside the reinforced windows, the Maryland dawn was breaking in shades of amber and rose, but Sarah barely noticed. Her world had contracted to the numbers scrolling before her eyes, each one a whisper from the cosmos that refused to make sense. "You're still here?" The voice startled her. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, his security badge still swinging from a lanyard around his neck. Marcus was her mentor, the man who had recruited her to the 3I Atlas Project 5 years ago, when she was just a bright-eyed postdoc with theories that bordered on science fiction. Now those theories were staring back at her from the screen, impossible and undeniable. "Marcus, you need to see this." Sarah's voice was hoarse, trembling with exhaustion and something else. Something that might have been wonder or terror. She couldn't quite tell which. The third imaging array data just came through from the orbital platform. The anomaly isn't moving away. It's coming closer. Marcus crossed the room in 3 long strides, his weathered face suddenly sharp with attention. At 62, he'd spent 4 decades in astrophysics, had his name on 17 major discoveries, and thought he'd seen everything the universe could throw at him. But as his eyes scanned the data Sarah had compiled, his hand found the edge of her desk and gripped it tight. 3I Atlas, officially designated 3I/2024A1, had first been detected 6 months ago by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, the same network that had given the object its name. Initially cataloged as just another interstellar visitor like Oumuamua before it, the object had seemed unremarkable in those early observations. A dark, tumbling rock from beyond the solar system, passing through our cosmic neighborhood on its way to somewhere else. Graduate students had written papers about its trajectory. Amateur astronomers had pointed their telescopes skyward, hoping for a glimpse. But then 3I Atlas had done something impossible. It had changed course. "Show me the velocity data again," Marcus said quietly. Sarah pulled up the relevant graphs, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. The lines painted a story that violated everything they understood about celestial mechanics. Objects in space follow predictable paths, governed by gravity and momentum. They didn't accelerate. They didn't adjust their trajectories. They certainly didn't orient themselves toward specific targets. Yet 3I Atlas had done all 3. "It started 3 weeks ago," Sarah explained, zooming in on the timeline. "Subtle at first. We thought it was outgassing like a comet, but the spectroscopic analysis came back wrong. No volatile compounds. No gas jets. Just directed thrusts." "Directed," Marcus repeated, and the word hung in the air between them like a confession. They both knew what it meant, what it implied, but neither wanted to say it aloud. Not yet. Not until they were absolutely certain. The door burst open, and Dr. Jennifer Park rushed in, her tablet clutched against her chest. Jenny was the youngest member of their core team, barely 30, with a mind for orbital mechanics that had earned her a position at NASA straight out of MIT. Right now, her face was flushed, her eyes wide with barely contained excitement. "The European Space Agency just confirmed our numbers," she said breathlessly. "And there's more. The James Webb Telescope caught something during the last observation window. Sarah, Marcus, it's not a rock. It's symmetrical." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "Show me." Jenny's fingers flew across her tablet, and she wirelessly cast the image to the main display. The room fell silent. The enhanced image from JWST showed 3I Atlas in unprecedented detail. Gone was the blurry, indistinct blob of earlier observations. In its place hung something that stole the breath from Sarah's lungs. The object was roughly cylindrical, perhaps 200 meters long and 60 meters wide at its widest point. Its surface wasn't the irregular, cratered terrain of an asteroid. Instead, it appeared smooth, almost metallic, with geometric patterns that couldn't possibly be natural formations. "My God," Marcus whispered. Sarah's mind raced through explanations, desperately seeking any natural phenomenon that could account for what she was seeing. Crystalline structures? Unlikely at that scale. Unusual mineral deposits? The symmetry was too perfect. Every avenue of conventional explanation led to a dead end, leaving only the one possibility that her scientific training told her to reject, but that her eyes couldn't deny. "We need to call Director Hoffman," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "This is beyond our authority level now." Marcus nodded slowly, unable to tear his gaze from the screen. "This is beyond anything, Sarah. Do you understand what we're looking at? This is first contact. This is everything." The words settled over them like snow, beautiful and heavy and transformative. First contact. Humanity's long-dreamed encounter with intelligence from beyond Earth. Every culture in history had wondered if we were alone, had looked up at the stars and asked the eternal question. And now, tumbling to the darkness of space, accelerating toward the inner solar system with clear purpose and design, came what might be the answer. Within 6 hours, Sarah found herself in a conference room she'd never seen before, deep in a section of Gada that required 3 separate security clearances to access. The room was windowless, the walls lined with screens displaying data feeds from observatories across the globe. Around the long table sat representatives from NASA, the Department of Defense, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and half a dozen other agencies whose acronyms Sarah only vaguely recognized. Director Patricia Hoffman sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression unreadable. She'd run NASA for 7 years, had weathered budget fights and political storms with equal grace. But Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed against the polished wood. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hoffman began, "what you're about to hear does not leave this room without explicit authorization. Dr. Chun, please present your findings." Sarah stood on legs that felt unsteady, activated her presentation, and began walking the room through 6 months of increasingly impossible data. She showed them the initial detection, the trajectory analysis, the moment when 3i Atlas had begun its course correction. She displayed spectroscopic readings that showed no sign of comet-like outgassing, radar returns that suggested a smooth, manufactured surface, and finally, the JWST images that had brought them all here. Based on current velocity and trajectory, she concluded, 3i Atlas will reach Earth orbit in approximately 17 days. The room erupted in overlapping voices. A Pentagon analyst demanded to know if it posed a collision threat. A White House staffer wanted to know who else knew about this. A representative from the Office of Planetary Defense asked about containment options. "Please." Hoffman's single word cut through the chaos. "Dr. Webb, what is your assessment?" Marcus stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. "In my professional opinion, we are observing an artificial object of non-terrestrial origin. Its behavior, structure, and composition are inconsistent with any natural phenomenon. Furthermore, its trajectory appears deliberately calculated to achieve orbital insertion around Earth." "You're saying it's alien," said General Matthew Carson from the Space Force, his voice flat and hard. "I'm saying it's not from Earth," Marcus replied carefully. "Whether it's currently inhabited, whether it's a probe or a vessel, whether its intentions are peaceful or hostile, these are questions we cannot yet answer. But what we can say with confidence is that we are about to have visitors, General, and we have 17 days to decide how we want to greet them." The meeting stretched on for 5 more hours. Contingency plans were drafted and discarded. Someone suggested attempting communication. Others argued for defensive postures. Sarah watched it all with a strange sense of detachment, her exhausted mind unable to fully process the magnitude of what was unfolding. At some point, sandwiches appeared. At another, she found herself giving an interview to the president's science advisor via secure video link, answering questions she'd never imagined she'd be asked. By the time she stumbled back to her office, the sun was setting again. Another day lost to the most important discovery in human history. She collapsed into her chair and stared at the latest images of 3i Atlas. In the updated photo, she could make out more details. What might be panel lines along its hull, structures that could be antennae or sensors, a configuration that suggested purpose and design. "Who are you?" she whispered to the image. "What do you want?" Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Rachel. "Saw weird stuff on Twitter about NASA detecting something. You okay?" Sarah's stomach dropped. No, she muttered, pulling up social media on her computer. Sure enough, the story was beginning to leak. Amateur astronomers had noticed the increased activity at major observatories. Someone had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for recent 3I Atlas data. A physics forum was filled with speculation about unusual orbital mechanics. The secret wouldn't hold much longer. She called Hoffman's direct line. "Director, we have a problem." Within 48 hours, NASA held a press conference. Sarah watched from backstage as Hoffman took the podium in front of a packed auditorium and a live global audience estimated at 2 billion people. The director spoke calmly, methodically, presenting the facts without speculation. An object of artificial origin, approaching Earth, estimated arrival in 15 days. The world's reaction was immediate and cacophonous. Stock markets plunged, then surged, then plunged again as investors tried to price the value of first contact. The United Nations called an emergency session. Religious leaders offered prayers and interpretations. Scientists demanded access to data. Conspiracy theorists claimed they'd known all along. In every language, on every continent, humanity grappled with a sudden, undeniable proof that we were not alone. Sarah retreated to her lab, tried to focus on work while the world transformed around her. There were still measurements to take, trajectories to refine, theories to test. Jenny and Marcus worked alongside her, the three of them becoming a small island of scientific inquiry in a sea of chaos. On day 12, 3I Atlas crossed the orbit of Mars. On day 14, it executed another course correction, fine-tuning its approach vector. On day 15, Sarah detected something new in the data stream and felt her blood run cold. "Marcus," she called out, her voice urgent. "It's not alone." The discovery of the other objects, 3 smaller craft that had been hiding in 3I Atlas's radar shadow, sent another shockwave through the already reeling world. These weren't passive hitchhikers. They were actively maneuvering, spreading out into a formation that suggested coordination and purpose. Each was perhaps 50 meters long, sleek and dark, moving with agility that made human spacecraft look like lumbering dinosaurs. Sarah barely left the lab now. None of them did. Cots had been brought in, showers installed in the adjacent facility. They existed in a bubble of data and coffee, tracking every movement, analyzing every signal, trying to understand the intentions of visitors who remained stubbornly silent. Because that was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of it all. 3I Atlas and its companions hadn't said a word. Every attempt at communication, radio signals, laser pulses, mathematical sequences, had been met with silence. The objects simply continued their approach, methodical and inexorable, while humanity watched and wondered and worried. "Maybe they don't communicate the way we do," Jenny suggested during one of their late-night theorizing sessions. She was sprawled on a cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind clearly racing despite her body's exhaustion. "Maybe they're observing us first, getting the lay of the land before making introductions. Or maybe they don't care what we think," muttered Dr. Raymond Torres, a new addition to their team from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. "Maybe we're not the reason they're here at all. We could be inconsequential to whatever their mission is." Sarah considered this. It was a humbling thought that humanity might be irrelevant to these visitors, but it was also, in some ways, less terrifying than the alternatives. If they were hostile, they would have attacked by now. If they were friendly, they would have announced themselves. Indifference, while bruising to the ego, suggested they might simply pass through without incident. On day 16, that hope died. The signal came at 3:47 a.m., and it wasn't directed at any of Earth's radio telescopes or communication arrays. Instead, it was a narrow-beam transmission aimed directly at the lab where Sarah and her team worked, targeted with impossible precision. One moment the room was filled with the usual hum of equipment and tired breathing. The next, every screen in the facility flashed white and displayed the same impossible message. Sarah stared at the words, her mind refusing to process them. "What promise?" she said aloud. "We've never met them before. We've never." But then the screens changed, and images began to flood across them. Images that made no sense. Ancient ruins Sarah didn't recognize. Structures that looked human but wrong. Architectural styles that predated recorded history. Photographs, How could it be photographs of people in archaic dress, standing beside monuments that shouldn't exist? A ziggurat unlike any in Mesopotamia. Its stones carved with symbols that hurt to look at. A megalithic structure that dwarfed Stonehenge, oriented to stars that weren't visible from Earth. A city of impossible geometry, built in a canyon that might have been the Grand Canyon, but tens of thousands of years before humans were supposed to have reached the Americas. This is impossible, Marcus breathed, but his voice carried uncertainty now. The scientist in him wanted to reject what he was seeing, but the images kept coming, each more inexplicable than the last. Then came the final image, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. It was clearly Earth, the continents recognizable but slightly wrong, their edges and shapes subtly different from modern maps. And in orbit around this ancient Earth hung a structure that could only be described as a station, not primitive, not ancient, but advanced, sleek and purposeful, built with engineering principles that wouldn't be understood for millennia. A timestamp appeared at the bottom of the image, 12,847 BC. "No," Sarah whispered. "That's not possible. We barely had agriculture then. We were hunter-gatherers. We didn't build cities, let alone space stations." The screens went dark, then displayed a new message. "Anamnesis," Jenny said softly. "Greek. It means remembering something forgotten, recovering lost knowledge." Before anyone could respond, every alarm in the facility began to sound at once. Sarah spun to her monitoring station and felt her heart hammer against her ribs. 3-Eye Atlas had just executed a deceleration burn of stunning power, bleeding off velocity at a rate that should have torn apart any conventional spacecraft. In the space of 15 minutes, it had gone from an approach vector to a relative standstill, now holding position at the L5 Lagrange point, a gravitationally stable orbit that would keep it permanently positioned in relation to Earth and Moon. The 3 smaller craft took up positions around the globe, one over the Pacific, one over the Atlantic, one over the Indian Ocean. They simply hung there, dark and silent, visible to anyone who looked up at the night sky, watching, waiting. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed Director Hoffman's emergency line. "Director, they've arrived, and they're claiming we have a history together. A history from before civilization." The world did not sleep that night. In every time zone, people gathered to stare at the sky, where the alien craft hung like impossible stars, visible even in daylight as dark spots against the blue. News channels ran continuous coverage, cycling through the same handful of facts and thousands of wild speculations. Scientists debated, politicians postured, religious leaders prayed or preached, depending on their interpretation of what this meant for humanity's place in creation. Sarah stood on the roof of the Goddard facility, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the chill of the October morning. Marcus joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood in companionable silence, watching the sun rise over a world that had changed forever. "Do you believe them?" Marcus finally asked. "About the promise? About us having a history with them?" Sarah took a slow sip of coffee, buying time to organize her thoughts. 2 days ago, I would have said it was insane. But Marcus, those images, I've been through every archaeological database I can access, and I can't find any of those structures. But the dating techniques they showed, the geological markers visible in the photographs, if they're fake, they're the most sophisticated fakes ever created. And why would they bother? Why come all this way to lie about our own history? "Unless they're not lying," Marcus said quietly. "Unless there's a chapter of human history that we've completely forgotten, a chapter where we weren't alone." The implications were staggering. If the visitors were telling the truth, then humanity's entire understanding of its own past was wrong. The neat story of gradual progress from primitive to civilized, from stone tools to skyscrapers, all of it was built on an incomplete foundation. What had been forgotten? What had been lost? Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from Hoffman. "Emergency briefing in 20 minutes. POTUS will be joining via secure link. We have a decision to make." The briefing room was even more crowded than before, with participants joining via video from around the world. The president appeared on the main screen, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past 2 weeks. Sarah couldn't blame him. This situation had no playbook, no historical precedent. Every decision carried the weight of the entire species. Dr. Chun, the president said, and Sarah felt every eye in the room focus on her. I'm told you've been studying the transmission from the alien craft. What's your recommendation? Do we respond? Do we attempt to engage with their claims about our shared history? Sarah stood, her legs steadier now than they'd been at the first briefing. Exhaustion and wonder had been replaced by something else. Determination. This was her life's work, the question she'd spent her career preparing to answer, even if she'd never imagined it would come in this form. Mr. President, members of the committee, I believe we have no choice but to engage. These beings have traveled between the stars to deliver a specific message to humanity. They claim to remember something we've forgotten, and they've chosen this moment to remind us. If we refuse to listen, to investigate their claims, we're not just missing a scientific opportunity. We're potentially ignoring something crucial about our own nature and history. But how can we trust them? Demanded General Carson. For all we know, this shared history story is a manipulation tactic. Make us believe we're old friends, so we lower our guard, then strike when we're vulnerable. Then why haven't they struck already? Jenny interjected, earning sharp looks from several of the more senior officials in the room. But she pressed on, her voice gaining confidence. They have technological capabilities so far beyond ours that they could have attacked without warning. They could have ignored us entirely. Instead, they position themselves in a non-threatening formation and sent us a message that invites inquiry, not conquest. Doesn't that suggest something about their intentions? The debate raged for 2 hours, positions hardening and softening in turn as new arguments were raised and countered. Finally, it was Marcus who proposed a solution that broke the deadlock. Send a small team, he said, not a military force, not a diplomatic mission heavy with officials and protocol. Send scientists, people trained to observe, to ask questions, to gather data. The transmission was aimed at our research facility, at the people studying them. That suggests they want to talk to scientists, not soldiers or politicians. Let's be the first point of contact. After another hour of discussion, the decision was made. A team of 5 scientists would be assembled and transported to the International Space Station, where one of the alien craft had agreed to rendezvous. The team would include Sarah as the lead researcher, Marcus for his experience, Jenny for her youth and fresh perspective, plus 2 specialists, Dr. Amara Okafor, a linguist and anthropologist from Oxford, and Dr. Kenji Tanaka, an archaeologist from Kyoto University, whose work on ancient civilizations made him invaluable for evaluating the historical claims. They had 3 days to prepare for a meeting that would define humanity's future. The launch was scheduled for dawn. Sarah sat in the crew quarters at Kennedy Space Center, trying to force down breakfast while her stomach churned with anticipation and fear. Through the window, she could see the rocket being prepared on the pad, looking deceptively normal. Just another launch, just another trip to the ISS. Except this time, they weren't going to study microgravity effects or conduct routine maintenance. They were going to meet beings from another world. Her phone showed messages from everyone she'd ever known. Her parents, terrified and proud. Rachel, who'd sent a string of texts ranging from "you're insane" to "you're my hero" and back again. Colleagues offering encouragement and advice. Friends saying goodbye, just in case. Just in case. The unspoken fear that this might be a one-way trip, that first contact might not go as smoothly as everyone hoped. Second thoughts. Marcus appeared in the doorway, already in his flight suit. Constant thoughts, Sarah admitted. 8,000 of them, all contradictory. Are we ready for this, Marcus? Really ready? He crossed the room and sat beside her, his weathered face thoughtful. No one is ready for this. How could we be? But Sarah, we're the closest thing humanity has prepared. We've studied them, tracked them, tried to understand them. If anyone can make this work, it's us. Jenny bounded in, her energy seemingly unaffected by nerves. Tanaka just got the final briefing from the UN. They want us to ask about 17 different things, including whether the visitors like jazz music. I'm not kidding. Some diplomat actually put that on the list. Despite everything, Sarah laughed. What did Kenji say? He told them he'd ask if we have time after discussing the complete rewriting of human history. Jenny's grin faded, replaced by something more serious. "Sarah, I've been thinking about those images they sent. If they're real, if we really did have contact with them thousands of years ago, what happened? Why did we forget? And more importantly, why are they reminding us now?" It was a question that had haunted Sarah for the past 3 days. She'd barely slept, spending every free moment analyzing the images, cross-referencing them with everything humanity knew about ancient history. And the more she looked, the more inconsistencies she found. Archaeological anomalies that had been dismissed as outliers suddenly looked like evidence. Ancient texts describing sky people and star teachers that had been relegated to mythology started seeming like eyewitness accounts. But that raised even more troubling questions. If humanity had achieved such heights 12,000 years ago, only fall back into Stone Age existence, what caused the collapse? And what do the visitors want now, in this age when humanity was once again reaching for the stars? The launch went smoothly, a textbook ascent that carried them into orbit in under 9 minutes. Sarah's stomach settled as weightlessness took hold, the familiar sensation from her previous 3 trips to the ISS. But as they docked with the station and entered the airlock, she knew nothing about this mission would be familiar. Commander James Richter met them as they floated into the station, his expression grim. "They're here," he said without preamble. "Arrived an hour ago and positioned themselves 200 meters off the starboard observation module. They're just waiting." Sarah pulled herself through the station's corridors with practiced efficiency, the rest of the team following close behind. When she reached the observation module and looked out the reinforced window, her breath caught in her throat. The alien craft hung against the backdrop of Earth like a work of art. Up close, she could see details invisible from the ground. The way light played across its dark surface, the intricate geometric patterns that covered hull, the gentle pulse of what might be navigation lights or power systems. It was perhaps 50 meters long, sleek and organic in its design, more like something grown than built. As she watched, a section of the craft's hull shifted, revealing an interior that glowed with soft, blue-white light. A passageway extended toward the station, a flexible tube of the same dark material, reaching out like an offered hand. "They want us to come aboard." Amara breathed, her dark eyes wide. Sarah activated her comm link. "Houston, we have visual confirmation. The visitors have opened their ship and extended what appears to be a docking bridge to the station, requesting permission to proceed with contact protocol." There was a pause, then Hoffman's voice came through, tight with tension. "Permission granted. Godspeed, Dr. Chun." The 5 scientists suited up in their EVA gear, though Sarah doubted it would offer much protection if things went wrong. They were about to board an alien spacecraft with technology centuries or millennia beyond their own. If the visitors meant them harm, space suits wouldn't save them. But as she pulled herself hand over hand to the flexible tunnel, feeling it seal behind them, Sarah wasn't thinking about danger. She was thinking about discovery, about the moment when everything changes, when the unknown becomes known and the universe expands in ways previously unimaginable. The tunnel opened into a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The interior was nothing like she'd expected, no cold metal corridors or harsh lighting. Instead, the space felt organic, almost alive, with walls that seemed to shift and flow like water frozen in time. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and warm, rendering shadows nearly obsolete. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 20 meters across, with what might be control panels along the walls, though they bore no resemblance to any human technology. And in the center of the chamber, waiting patiently, stood the first confirmed extraterrestrial intelligence humanity had ever encountered. They were tall, at least 2.5 meters, with slender builds that suggested either lower gravity or simply different evolutionary pressures. Their skin was a deep, iridescent blue-gray that seemed to shift slightly in the light. They had 2 arms and 2 legs, but their proportions were all wrong by human standards, limbs too long, fingers too numerous. Their heads were large and somewhat elongated, with eyes that dominated their faces, large, dark, and filled with an intelligence that was immediately apparent. But what struck Sarah most was the expression those eyes held. Not alien aloofness or predatory focus, but something that looked remarkably like sadness mixed with hope. One of the beings stepped forward, and when it spoke, the sound came not from its mouth, but from the walls themselves, translated into English with only the slightest synthetic quality. Welcome, children of Earth. We are the archivists of the Stellar Concordance, and we have waited a very long time for you to be ready to hear what we have to say. Sarah floated in the alien chamber, her mind struggling to process the moment. Every instinct screamed that this couldn't be real, that she was dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. But the being before her was undeniably present, solid and real, regarding them with those impossibly expressive eyes. You called yourselves archivists, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor Sarah could see in his hands. Archivists of what exactly? The being tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost human. Of memory, of history, of the connections between worlds and the species that inhabit them. We are keepers of what was, so that it might inform what will be. It gestured, and suddenly the walls of the chamber came alive with images. Earth, but not the Earth Sarah knew. This Earth had continents in slightly different configurations, coastlines that didn't quite match modern maps. And dotting those continents were cities, not primitive villages, but sophisticated settlements with architecture that spoke of advanced understanding of engineering and design. 12,847 years before your current era, the archivist said, its translated voice carrying notes of deep sorrow. Your world was very different. Humanity had risen to heights you have only recently begun to approach again. You had agriculture, mathematics, astronomy. You had built ships that sail not just across oceans, but up to the stars. That's impossible, Kenji said, though his voice lacked conviction. As an archaeologist, he'd spent his career studying human development, and the timeline the archivist described violated everything he knew. We have no evidence of any civilization that advanced more than 5,000 years ago, let alone 12,000. You have no memory of it, the archivist corrected gently. The evidence exists, though most of it lies beneath oceans that didn't exist then, or buried under sediments laid down by the catastrophe. But the lack of memory, that was intentional. That was survival. Another image appeared, a comet, massive and terrible, breaking apart as it entered Earth's atmosphere. Sarah watched in horror as the fragments struck across the globe, impact after impact, each one releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. Oceans vaporized and fell back as endless rain. Continents cracked. The sky turned black with debris. The younger dry as impact, Amara whispered. We found evidence of it in ice cores and geological strata. A massive impact event that triggered rapid climate change. But we thought it was a single strike, not multiple impacts. And we never imagined. You never imagined that it struck a thriving global civilization instead of primitive hunter-gatherers, the archivist finished. Because the survivors, and there were survivors, though far fewer than had lived before, they had to forget. The trauma was too great, the loss too absolute. Humanity underwent a collective amnesia, a psychological severing from the past. It was the only way to begin again. Sarah's mind reeled. But if we were that advanced, if we had star travel, why didn't we stop it? Why couldn't we deflect a comet or evacuate? Because your civilization was young, the archivist said, and now the sadness in its voice was unmistakable. You had barely reached the stars when the comet came. You had space stations, 3 of them orbiting your world. You had a small colony on your moon, but you didn't have the technology or the time to prevent what was coming. We detected the comet, calculated its trajectory, and sent warning. We even dispatched ships to help. But we were too far away, and the comet moved too fast. The chamber walls showed new images, sleek alien craft racing toward Earth, trying desperately to intercept the comet. Sarah saw weapons fired, saw chunks of ice and rock blasted apart. But there were too many fragments coming from too many angles. We saved what we could, the archivist continued. Thousands of your people transported to safety aboard our vessels. Knowledge preserved in archives. Seeds and genetic samples secured. But most of humanity died in the impacts and the aftermath. The ice age that followed lasted for centuries. The survivors scattered, fragmented, lost most of what they had known. And when stability finally returned, They were starting over from nearly nothing. "The people you saved," Jenny said, her voice barely audible. "What happened to them?" "They lived among us for a time, on our worlds. But Earth was their home, and eventually most chose to return. We brought them back once the climate stabilized, helped them rebuild in small ways. But we couldn't restore what was lost. That had to come from within humanity itself. So we made a promise. We would watch over your world, record your history, preserve what you achieved. And when you were ready, when you had climbed back to stars on your own strength, we would return and remind you of what you once were." The archivist gestured to the viewport, where Earth hung in all its blue-green glory. "You have reached the stars again. You have touched your moon, sent machines to explore your planetary neighbors, looked deep into the cosmos with instruments of remarkable sensitivity. You have earned the right to know your full history, to reclaim the memory of the heights your ancestors achieved and catastrophe they endured." Marcus wiped at his eyes, and Sarah realized he was crying. Tough, rational Marcus Webb, who'd spent 40 years in science believing humanity was alone in the universe, was weeping at the revelation that humans had walked among aliens 12,000 years ago. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why after all this time? We've been sending radio signals into space for a century. We've had rockets for decades. What made this the right moment?" The archivist's large eyes fixed on her with sudden intensity. "Because the comet is returning." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of the alien ship systems. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "What?" she whispered. "The comet that struck your world. You call it 12P/Ponsbrooks in this era, though it bore different names in ancient times. It follows a long elliptical orbit, returning to your inner solar system every 71 years. Most passes are harmless, but once every 6,000 years, give or take, its orbit intersects with a debris field left behind by another celestial body. The collision scatters fragments, destabilizes a comet, sends pieces tumbling toward the inner planets. The wall showed a simulation, a comet's graceful orbit suddenly disrupted, fragments breaking away, tumbling toward a small blue world. It happened 12,800 years ago, the archivist said, and our calculations indicate it will happen again in approximately 17 months. Sarah had to grip a handhold to keep from floating away as the chamber seemed to spin around her. 17 months. Barely more than a year before fragments of an apocalyptic comet would rain down on Earth, potentially ending human civilization, just as it had 12 millennia ago. "No," she heard herself say. "No, that's not possible. We monitor near-Earth objects. We track comets. Someone would have seen this coming. You monitor known threats," the archivist replied. "But the debris field the comet will encounter lies beyond the orbit of Jupiter. From your vantage point, it appears empty, just one of the countless dark regions of space between worlds. Only from our position, watching from outside your solar system for decades, could we detect the danger." Kenji had pulled out a tablet and was frantically calculating. 12,800 years ago, plus 6,000 year cycles. That means there should have been another impact event around 6,800 years ago, around 4,800 BC. He looked up, his face pale. The Black Sea deluge, the biblical flood myths, the Sumerian and Akkadian flood stories.